Hello, 8th graders. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 12, Section 2, Conflicts Over Land. So, we're going to talk a little bit about a very controversial event in U.S. history, and we're going to talk about the removal of Native Americans, primarily the Cherokee, from parts of the American Southeast to what would be eventually be declared the Indian Territory, which is now present day Oklahoma. So, in number one, the Cherokees, Creeks, Seminoles, Chickasaw, and Choctaw Native Americans were known as the five civilized tribes. They lived in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida, and they were labeled the five civilized tribes because they had created farming communities. They were not necessarily nomadic. They had, for the most part, accumulated some wealth, except probably the big issue they had was the influx of new people coming into their territory. So, as westward expansion continued, some white people wanted the land held by the Native Americans in the East, and it asked the government to relocate these people to lands west of the Mississippi River, thinking that for a time that would not be an issue for some folks. So if you take a look at the chart kind of in the bottom right hand corner, you can kind of see the numbers of people that were forced to migrate between the 1830s and 1840s. You can see the Choctaw, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, and the Seminoles. And by far, the Creek and the Cherokee were probably forced to be moved probably far more than the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole. So, in number three, Congress passes the Indian Removal Act in 1830, and it creates the Indian Territory west of the Mississippi in what I was saying is present-day Oklahoma. But if you look at the map here, there's also territory that would be more likely in present-day Kansas. So groups that eventually are going to be removed from their territory that they're holding are like the Sac and the Fox that have their tribes kind of in parts of Wisconsin, Illinois, and the state of Iowa. Their reservation today is actually south of Falls City, Nebraska. But that's another subject. Going back to number three, President Andrew Jackson sent federal officials to negotiate treaties with the Native Americans in the American Southeast. Sometimes these negotiators were not necessarily the best versed in the language of the Native people that they were trying to speak to. And there were some things that were lost in translation. So, in number four, in 1834, Congress created the Indian Territory, an area in present-day Oklahoma. Most Eastern Native American people felt forced to sell their land and to move westward. If you take a look at the map, the group of people that we're going to speak about as far as the Trail of Tears are primarily the Cherokee that were located in the northern part of Georgia and a little bit of southern, maybe southwestern North Carolina, a little bit of southeastern Tennessee. If you look at like the Chickasaw and the Choctaw, a lot of them are located in states like Mississippi and Alabama. Same goes with the Creek. So in number five, the Cherokee refused to sell their land because there were some treaties that go back to the 1790s where the federal government had recognized the Cherokee as a separate nation. They had their own constitution and system of government. In Georgia, where many Cherokee lived, the state had refused to accept the Cherokee status, and in 1830, they had made the land held by them part of the state. In other words, their land was taken from them. President Jackson supported the state of Georgia's efforts to remove the Cherokee, but in the case of Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, the Cherokee took their issues to the Supreme Court. And the Chief Justice of the court at that time was a fellow named John Marshall. Marshall was going to go on to have a pretty illustrious career, but he ruled that Georgia didn't have the right to interfere with the Cherokee. And for the most part, this should have been the end of the ordeal. The Cherokee should have been able to stay on their land, and this would have been the end of the story. But as I say, not so fast. There is the rest of the story. So President Jackson, who supported the state of Georgia, ignored the court's decision, and he declared that John Marshall should now let him enforce it. If you remember back to when we talked about the Constitution and kind of I guess you could say, the powers of the different branches, it's really the responsibility of the president to enforce the law. It's the courts to interpret it. And the court had interpreted it. And Jackson refused to listen to its interpretation. If this were the modern day and age, it's possible that maybe Jackson could have been impeached for what he was doing. But that's not how history works. So most of the 17,000 Cherokee had refused to give up their land. By 1835, the federal government convinced a small number of Cherokee, about 500, to sign the Treaty of New Ecta. And this treaty, basically, the group would agree to give up all Cherokee land by 1838. Chief John Ross, who you see pictured on the far right side, he sent a protest to the U.S. Senate explaining that the few Cherokee who signed the treaty were not authorized to do so. U.S. Senator Daniel Webster and Henry Clay opposed the treaty because they saw it as unfair. But, as they say, that's not how this all turns out. In 1836, the Senate approved the treaty regardless. And thus the ball is rolling to start this relocation of Native Americans, primarily the Cherokee. So, by 1838, only 2,000 Cherokee had moved west. President Martin Van Buren, who is now the new president of the United States, he ordered the U.S. Army to relocate the rest of the Cherokee to the Indian Territory. And this is where we get into this situation of talking about, the kind of the Trail of Tears, so to speak. General Winfield Scott, who we're going to eventually hear more about when we talk about the war with Mexico and eventually the start of the U.S. Civil War. He brought the army of about 7,000 federal troops into Georgia to remove the Cherokee from their homes. And between June and December of 1838, soldiers moved nearly 15,000 people from North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee. As many as 2,000 Cherokee died from illness, hunger, and exposure to the weather in the forced journey westward. And this becomes known as the Trail of Tears. And for the most part, a very unfortunate history. So, resistance to the removal. The Seminoles of Florida were the only Native Americans who successfully resisted their forced removal, and thus were able to stay. Their leader, a man named Osceola, leader of the Seminoles and his people, went to war against the United States rather than to leave their home state of Florida. And they won. And thus, Osceola is considered to be a kind of a heroic figure. And when you talk about Florida State as a university, they're going to use the Seminoles as their mascot. So between 1835 and 1942, about 3,000 Seminoles and African Americans known as Black Seminoles fought some 30,000 U.S. soldiers. By 1842, the war had cost the U.S. government over $20 million. It's quite a bit of money for the pre-Civil War era. And more than 1,500 American soldiers had died, forcing the government to give up this whole process. So, in number 14, Native Americans gave up more than 100 million acres of land in exchange for $68 million and about 32 million acres of land west of the Mississippi River, where they lived on reservations, primarily in the eastern part of Oklahoma. Long story short, there's always a little bit of a reckoning that comes from this. What's interesting is there is some of this land that the Cherokee was settled on that had oil on it. And eventually the Cherokee Nation is going to profit from that, but not before they have to go through a lot of hardship. Thank you very much.